Well, it was inevitable. I have to review Kick-Ass now on Superhero Rewind, on my family-friendly channel with no vulgar language. I wouldn't usually even say the word kick-ass, but I can't help it in this case. It's the name of the movie. It's a good thing it wasn't called Super Fighters or the bullshit Avengers. The following is an in-depth analysis. If you haven't seen this movie, you might want to before watching this review. This is going to be a tough review, and I hope some of this makes some kind of sense because I don't know how to fully articulate my relationship with Kick-Ass. I don't want to call it a guilty pleasure because that term is usually reserved for movies that really aren't very good, but that one can't help but eat up with a spoon anyway. There's so much right with Kick-Ass that that's unfair. There's a lot of really sophisticated visual storytelling in Michael Vaughn's directing. The acting is first class. The same care went into this that went into X-Men first class, despite how strikingly dissimilar those movies are. For such a strange beast with a really difficult balance to strike between comedy and drama, Vaughn intelligently starts slow, beginning in a totally quirky teen comedy place, and then ramps up the absurd violence in the comic book satire until it reaches such a high-octane level in the final moments we're ready to see Kick-Ass shooting a bunch of mob thugs with Gatling guns sitting atop a jetpack. I was so satisfied in the theater by that reveal. The thing Big Daddy paid $300,000 for was a jetpack? There's a fantastic sense of continuity in the movie. So many small setups and then payoffs to reward the audience for noticing, like the teddy bear in the warehouse that turns out to be a surveillance camera. And for a movie that seems fixated on pushing the vulgarity and especially the brutality to the farthest reaches of bearability and yet still be knee-slappingly entertaining and often laugh-out-loud hysterical all at the same time, it's nothing short of remarkable how much real heart and depth there is to these characters. Big Daddy is without a shadow of a doubt a sociopath. What he's done to his daughter is, as Marcus calls it, absolutely brainwashing. I should find this man fully condemnable, and I should have pity for what he's turned Hit Girl into, but I certainly shouldn't be smiling or applauding or laughing when she massacres entire rooms full of people. But I must admit that at times, I did exactly that. And I also must admit that when Mindy and Dave return to Big Daddy's headquarters after the mob boss Frankie has just had Big Daddy set on fire and burned alive on streaming video, and Mindy picks up the 2 hot chocolates they were just about to enjoy before Red Mist set his trap for them, I absolutely had tears welling up in my eyes. I don't appreciate violence for the sake of violence, and I don't find stabbings, beheadings, shootings, and torture fun things to watch all by themselves. And to each his own and all that, but quite frankly, I question people who go to movies because they want to see those things. There is a time and a place for all things in a story. Bad, unwholesome, tragic, disgusting, reprehensible, evil acts happen to people. We can't say anything about human behavior if we ignore human cruelty, and very often those things create the very thing that is at the heart of every story. Conflict. And yet sometimes movies are more about the spectacle than they are about the narrative, and like a lot of video games, the narrative can be a loose framework to make the spectacle happen. Even in musicals with great stories, some people are only there for the music. I've never watched the Fast and the Furious films, but the people I know who like those have never once told me anything a character does in those movies. They go to see cars drive fast. So as someone who loves movies as a storytelling medium, I would call things like that guilty pleasures. It might not be narratively a good film, but it might be a good ride. I can see why a person might go to the theater to see people dance or play basketball or jump over rooftops, but I personally derive no pleasure out of seeing extreme violence. Except this movie made it fun. Between my caring about the people I was following, the exciting camera work and choreography, and choice of score, especially the punk version of the Banana Split song when Kick-Ass and Hit Girl meet for the first time, I did. The real drama of the film did carry me through the movie. There is absolutely a good story here, and that elevates it above simple superhero parody. But I have to say that I also genuinely enjoyed some of the really rough and I would argue really unnecessary violence, especially when it was Hit Girl doling out the punishment. And I don't like that I liked that, partly because I'm not sure what it says about me, but also because the fun of the violence is at odds with the main idea of the movie, which is that being a superhero, if someone tried to do it in the real world without powers, wouldn't be fun. you likely wouldn't survive your first time out. The movie really drives the point home the first time Kick-Ass confronts a couple car thieves, and he gets knifed and then hit by a car, that a regular person putting on a suit and taking on crime is impractical, dangerous, and just all around a bad idea. In his commentary during that scene, Matthew Vaughn even feels the need to stress that he wanted to do the opposite of romanticizing costume vigilantes, by giving Dave and the audience a real dose of reality there, and he even stresses kids do not go out and try this. But then, in a movie all about how fragile human bodies are in comparison to how they're often depicted in comics, that you or I couldn't take as many punches as Batman does in any given evening and be able to talk to anyone the next day, much less go back out and do it all over again the next night, why are so many of the fights and shootouts so much freaking fun? I'm not saying it makes me want to go out and be a superhero. It absolutely succeeds at making it seem like a really stupid thing to do, but the movie is sending mixed signals, at least to me, because I feel like it's a warning about how violent the criminal underbelly of a big US city like New York really can be, and yet a celebration of violence all at the same time. And that contradiction is inherent in the material. The movie has a solid, consistent tone, and outside of the action scenes, it's never jarring or inappropriate when the movie transitions from over-the-top hilarity to genuine, gut-wrenching pathos. I laugh with and cry with both Kick-Ass and Hit Girl in this movie, and even with Red Mist, who ultimately goes down the villain's path but is a fully sympathetic antagonist. The raunchiness with its constant F-bombs and its masturbation humor and the hardcore brutality is what the movie was most sold on. Like, finally, the adult superhero movie you go to see so that you can see if you can keep yourself from looking away from it. And I guess I feel like the story was better than that and didn't need so much of that raunchiness. And so even though that raunchy stuff doesn't do anything for me, and I feel like ultimately the movie could have lived without it, I could look past it because I appreciated the characters and I was involved in what was going on. I don't think I would have liked the movie nearly as much if it was fully faithful to its source material, because the characters in the Kick-Ass comic book are not as likable or relatable as they are here. Matthew Vaughn even says in his commentary that he finds Mark Millar's characters horrible people. It's like it had to be vulgar and raunchy because the book was known for that, but it wouldn't be accessible to a very wide audience if we didn't, give a crap about anyone we were watching. Big Daddy might be a sociopath here, but I like him and weirdly have a certain amount of respect for him because of the relationship he has with his daughter. In the comics, he just pretends like the mob killed his wife, so he has an excuse to raise his daughter to go beat up bad guys. Hit Girl might still be worth watching in that version. After all, it's not her fault her dad was certifiable. But imagine having to watch that dynamic play out for 2 hours versus what we had here, a relationship that, as messed up as it is sickly charming and sweet and actually makes me care about Big Daddy, even if I don't like or condone his actions. The major success of this film is that it greatly improves on its source material. I'd argue that it's even too faithful to the spirit of the original. I think the comics could have done with some of the heart this movie has, though it could be argued that the comics are straight up satire, whereas there's a grounded human story at the core of the film version. It's one of those rare instances where being accessible actually works in favor of the story. It homages, pokes fun at, and challenges superhero tropes and archetypes, but in a wonderfully character-driven way. Kick-Ass is, at its foundation, yet another what-if superheroes existed in the real world story. But like Watchmen, it's a world that's grittier than Golden or Silver Age comics, and people aren't generally as noble or optimistic as they are in those books, but it's still a heightened reality. Dave even sort of has a superpower, his screwed-up nerve endings, to make it more believable that he can survive more than a day on the job. It's more of a commentary about the unrealism in superhero stories than an attempt at putting superheroes in the real world. And like all good superhero stories, it's about how heroes inspire people. But this time, it's done the way it is in our reality. If people really did put on costumes and try to fight crime, and some actually do, they would be inspired by fictional superheroes because we don't have any real ones to speak of. And so it's a story about average people trying to live up to their perfect ideals and their icons, and that's what I really latched onto. Dave is a good everyman because there's nothing inherently special about him, and he's quite relatable because, like a lot of teenagers with no direction or sense of identity, he wants to be something extraordinary. But when he looks at extraordinary people, he sees some profound turning point in their lives that motivates them to develop their talents. I remember being in junior high school and worrying that if nothing really horrible ever happened to me, I might grow up really boring and insignificant. I suppose a lifetime of looking up to characters like Batman will do that to you. If you don't have a concrete personal connection to a cause, how can you devote your life to it? So the superhero origin story is turned on its head by Dave's total lack of purpose being his motivation to put on a costume in the first place. Superheroes generally put on costumes because they have a unique gift they can use to help people, but Dave's unique gift is the gumption to put the costume on. Continuing that common superhero trend, it's a sense of responsibility that keeps superheroes in the costume, conveniently providing a way to give them endless adventures in an open-ended, ongoing, serialized narrative. I like that it begins as purely selfish desire to feel significant in some way, but it becomes something more noble. As Dave constantly runs into widespread apathy, a seemingly universal sense of every man for himself, and finds that time after time, if someone sees another person in trouble, he'd rather ignore it than put himself on the line, Dave's compulsion to be a superhero becomes about something larger than himself. Toward the end of the movie, in voiceover, Dave says sarcastically, "With no power comes no responsibility," meaning that there wasn't a single concrete thing forcing him to put on that costume and fight crime, that if he had just stayed home and dreamed about being a superhero rather than going through with it, he wouldn't be sitting in a chair getting beaten to within an inch of his life. But he quickly takes that back and says, but that wasn't true. Despite being in over his head, nearly getting killed on multiple occasions, and not even kind of being prepared for how scary the world really can be when one person decides to change it alone, Dave sticks to his optimism and decides that perfect strangers in need are worth risking his life for. What he's doing seems bizarre and irresponsible on the surface, but what's really irresponsible, he finds, is that civilized people can live with themselves, standing around and watching other people get hurt. Many people have Dave's version of the tragic superhero backstory. It's a strong commentary on the isolation and lack of personal involvement in each other's lives brought on by our current million distractions of present-day society. It's so easy to passively consume entertainment, playing video games, watching television, reading comics, wishing and dreaming and hoping, but never actually getting up and doing anything about it. While Kick-Ass in many ways goes against the traditional comic book grain, the message of one person can make a difference and leading by dramatic example is alive and well in this movie. And if that were the whole movie, it would be an entirely optimistic and hopeful sort of story. But of course, the naive, idealistic protector of the innocent isn't the only superhero archetype represented here. Big Daddy is the Dark Avenger, the Punisher to Kick-Ass's Spider-Man. And I was surprised that originally Kick-Ass was conceived without Kick-Ass. Originally the comics were just going to be Big Daddy and Hit Girl. I can't even imagine this story without that sense of optimism. Big Daddy is a lot more interested in revenge than he is in justice, and he's raising his daughter that way, but spinning it like they really do live in a comic book world. They have a specific mission as opposed to Kick-Ass's broad goal of helping whoever's getting screwed over by someone else. They want to take down Frankie's whole drug operation and get even for Big Daddy's imprisonment and the indirectly related death of his wife who couldn't cope with the situation and overdosed on pills. For Big Daddy, it's not about wish fulfillment. The superhero persona gives him a convenient way to hide a secret identity and creates an environment where he can include his 11-year-old girl. He really does have something closer to the traditional tragic backstory, and the film implies that in a world closer to ours, a person who obsessed over the death of a loved one and took the law into their own hands would be more likely to develop a dangerous, deranged psychosis and seek out vengeance rather than become a public servant. The argument, or perhaps it's the joke, seems to be that it would take someone with nothing better to do rather than someone with a chip on his shoulder to do what Kick-Ass does. I also like that he had 5 years in prison of humiliation to develop his warped psychology, and that makes more sense than the instant transformation so many fictional vigilantes have. Nicolas Cage is brilliant in this role. I love the Adam West voice he uses, and he demonstrates sincere affection for Mindy. While his choice to raise her this way is demented, it's hard to hate him as a father. He teaches his daughter self-respect, discipline, and a lot of really useful practical life skills. But more than that, we see example after example of his love, his admiration, and pride for his daughter, and the bizarre contrast between the almost wholesome way they treat each other and the activities they do together. It's hard not to find it really funny. This movie is brilliant at making me laugh at things and then hate myself for it. I laughed at a father shooting his daughter at point-blank range. Sure, she was wearing a bulletproof vest, but you've got to hand it to Matthew Vaughn. I was charmed by a man shooting his 11-year-old daughter in the chest. But where the comedy gets in the way for me is in Kick-Ass's attitude toward Hit Girl and Big Daddy. They're mass murderers, and he knows it, but he calls them the real deal. We have one moment of real uncertainty as the stark truth rushes over Dave in his room right after the scene where Hit Girl butchers a whole pack of thugs in a room to save him. And at first I think what's torturing him is that all those people died because of him. Kick-Ass never resorts to violence right away. Every time he tries to stop a crime, he gives the bad guys a chance to stop what they're doing before he starts wailing on them with his sticks. He can't be comfortable with Hit Girl's methods, yet he never confronts Big Daddy or Hit Girl about them. As the film progresses, he doesn't really seem put off by it at all, and I'm forced to assume that when he broke down in his room, it was because he realized how unprepared he is for crime fighting and not because of all the guys who got killed. And I don't think it's that he's involved himself with a sociopath and he knows it, so he's just too afraid to say anything. He admires Big Daddy and Hit Girl and berates himself for not being as careful and sharp as they are, like when he's embarrassed for not thinking to mask his IP address on his website so people can't just track him to his house. I think the profound difference in moralities between these characters should have been more at the forefront. Shouldn't Big Daddy and Hit Girl serve as a shattering disillusionment when he realizes that not only is he not the first one to try it, which bothers him of course, because being the first is what he thought made him special, but the only way to successfully operate and stay alive seems to be to kill everything that moves. That's not what he signed up for. After all, it is Kick-Ass and not Hit Girl or Big Daddy that inspires other superheroes, and so the film seems to say that he really is the first superhero, that what he's doing is heroic as opposed to just vigilante justice. Other characters, namely Marcus, call Big Daddy what he is, a sociopath, a mass murderer, but there's another layer to this story that's never explored and awkwardly ignored, with Kick-Ass going along with all that violence and not really being a part of the worst of it until the very end. And so I'm conflicted about Dave's use of guns at the end, because on the one hand, he's saving Hit Girl and the men he kills are all armed and dangerous, so it's necessary. But then again, I question his agreeing to go there in the first place. Why doesn't he make more of a distinction between saving people and getting retribution? He understands Hit Girl's desire to see Frankie pay for the death of her father, and he feels responsible because he led Big Daddy into an ambush. But I feel like this kid would be more hesitant to go shoot up a whole house full of guys in the name of revenge, or at the very least, he'd be traumatized by it after it happens. It seems perhaps cynical that the way Dave moves past his naive sensibilities about the simplicities of helping people is that he learns from a deranged ex-cop and his brainwashed daughter how to become comfortable with guns and killing people. The problem is that the movie tries to have its cake and eat it too. It's impossible to separate the serious from the ridiculous, so I'm made to care about Dave, but at the same time, because there's this absurd component to the movie, I'm also not supposed to take it too seriously or read into its larger implications. In a movie that earns its darkness, where I can accept a grown man beating the pulp out of an 11-year-old girl because of the larger story context and what that scene means for these characters, after all, it's a big deal when Frankie says, "I wish I had a son like you," I have a hard time accepting that so much of the violence is treated as set dressing and that Dave isn't as repelled by it as I would be. I realize one of the superhero motifs the movie dabbles into is whether the hero causes more problems than he solves. If his very presence inspires as much destruction as it does good, and the sequel really runs with that one. But I question how responsible Dave really is for Big Daddy's death, given that Big Daddy is pretty careless about how he handles that. Dave gives him the secret signal that he wants to meet, posting on his website that he's on vacation. So without finding out what it's about or anything, Big Daddy just sends Kick-Ass the address to his secret headquarters and invites him over. When they first meet, Big Daddy says, "We like you, but we don't trust you," and for good reason. He's entirely careless and untrained, and anyone could find him with all the evidence he leaves behind if they just looked hard enough. So what's changed at this point in the movie? So of course, Kick-Ass brings Red Mist to Big Daddy's headquarters and they get ambushed. That strikes me as flimsy plotting to get characters from point A to point B, and it somewhat undermines Big Daddy's credibility. It's hard to believe he stayed hidden this long if he's capable of those sorts of mistakes. On a side note, Matthew Vaughn says in his commentary that this was really made like an independent film, though I doubt most people look at it that way or realize how small the movie's budget was. He says, as many good filmmakers experience making minimalistic movies, that not having much money is sometimes better because it forces you to be more creative, and great ideas can come out of that. One of those was the way Big Daddy's origin story is worked into the narrative. Vaughn didn't have the money to film a whole backstory montage, so he had John Romita Jr. draw it in panels, and they turned it into a sort of motion comic. What was done for practical reasons turned into a great storytelling choice. It's always better if you can give this kind of information in a natural way inside the progressing story, rather than interrupting the narrative with flashbacks. Sometimes flashbacks are the only way to do it, but this works really well because we aren't suddenly thrown back in time, having to mentally hold our place while we go experience a mini-story to inform our otherwise linear narrative. It's also a really clever way to acknowledge this story's comic book roots, and this really is a comic book world designed to provide commentary and parody of other comic book worlds. It's nice to see some John Romita art in the film, especially since the comic and the film were really developed together. Unlike most movies based on comics, this one didn't sit on the shelves for a long time before someone decided to make a movie. The movie rights were sold before the first issue even came out, and so Mark Millar and John Romita Jr. knew what they were doing was being adapted, and surely that would influence the creative process. Besides being a story about wish fulfillment and teenage identity crisis, this is also a story about family and living up to parents' expectations. Hit Girl and Red Mist have dual character arcs, and how they each perceive their relationship with their respective fathers shapes the people they ultimately become. Even though he's turning his daughter into a homicidal vigilante, Mindy has so much respect and reverence for her father, not just because of the training he gives her, but because he believes in her and constantly shows her he's proud of her. He's both a terrible father and a fantastic father all at the same time. Conversely, Frankie has no faith in his son, and their relationship is entirely superficial. It's a little better than Norman and Harry Osborn's relationship in that at least Frankie gives his kid more of the time of day, but he won't teach him anything about his business, not so much because he doesn't think a 17-year-old kid should be involved, but because he doesn't like the man his kid seems to be turning into. He's too nerdy and socially awkward. Mob bosses don't read comic books. How can he ever be confident and intimidating enough to run the family business? But surprisingly, Frankie is also not a completely wooden villain. We get to see a lot of great details about him, and he actually spends some time with his kid, taking him to the movie theater and such. He's eccentric, spends his money on modern art, like those enormous Andy Warhol paintings of guns that should seem ridiculous but somehow fit the decor, and he cares about his family and what his kid thinks of him, even if he doesn't like what his kid is turning into, illustrated by the scene where Frankie is so distressed about his men getting killed, seemingly by Kick-Ass, that he starts snorting cocaine, which he apparently gave up at some point, and puts it away in a frenzy when Chris walks in. Frankie does finally give Chris a chance to get involved when his comic book knowledge comes in handy dealing with Kick-Ass, and he comes to his dad with a well-thought-out plan of how to trap Kick-Ass. But Frankie never truly appreciates his son because his heart's not really in crime, as much as he wants to live up to his father's expectations. Chris isn't inspired by his dad the way he's inspired by superheroes, and his admiration for Kick-Ass gets in the way of the new relationship he's building with his father. Chris, like Harry Osborn or Smallville's Lex Luthor, is conflicted. He sees two clear paths set out before him, and he's forced to choose one. He didn't count on liking or looking up to Kick-Ass, but he really admires what Kick-Ass is doing. Despite that, he feels an obligation to his father, and reluctantly chooses the darker path, only fully owning it at the very end when Kick-Ass kills his dad and he's able to reinvent himself as a supervillain, which is clearly what he has in mind when he quotes Jack Nicholson from Batman, "Wait till they get a load of me." What a cool ending. His arc is essentially the same as Harry Osborn's, with the added twist of his pretending to befriend the superhero and inadvertently actually caring about the superhero, which makes me appreciate him more and makes his turn to the dark side, while hilarious, a little sad. It's interesting that with the classic father-son and father-daughter motifs, our main protagonist doesn't really have that mentor figure he's trying to live up to, even though his dad is still alive. Yet Kick-Ass still represents another side to this idea. He's the kid who didn't have a real-life role model, so he buried himself in a fantasy and found inspiration there, like so many kids do. If he had any pride in his father, he might have some other goal to strive for, and he wouldn't see himself as such a loser. This point is really hit home in the sequel, while only vaguely present here, that Dave is inspired to make something of himself because he feels like his father never did, so instead of having expectations to live up to, he has to raise the bar and create those standards for himself. We don't see very much of Dave's father here, and we have only the broad sense that his dad's been sad and pathetic ever since his wife died, indicated subtly by a scene where they sit together in silence at the breakfast table, which is framed the same way and has Dave and his father sitting in the same places as they were in the brief flashback of his mother's sudden, pointless death. And that's the main thing he and Hit Girl have in common. When Big Daddy dies, she says, "My mother died for nothing. I won't let my daddy die for nothing too." And suddenly Dave's non-dramatic, not-so-tragic death of a parent feels very poignant and at the heart of why he became a superhero. That's good stuff. I really enjoy all the other familiar superhero motifs that are turned on their head too, like the "I'm Batman" moment where Dave goes to Katie's house to finally reveal his secret identity to his secret love, except in this universe you can't just sneak into a girl's bedroom and expect her to throw herself at you. No, she's gonna pepper spray you and hit you with whatever she can find and scream bloody murder and probably call the cops. So he reveals his identity and also that he's not really gay, and the scene really takes its time so that by the end I can finally buy her reluctantly asking Dave to stay and letting his fantasy play out once she's gotten over the shock. In the comics, this is the end of their relationship, but the movie allows her to become his Mary Jane, and it works because it's what she's wanted all along. Very early on in their friendship, she tells him she wishes he wasn't gay. I do have to question the reason people think he's homosexual, though, because it doesn't follow to me, and it was the same in the comic, too. What everyone thinks happened is that Dave got mugged, stripped naked, and stabbed, and of course, his father has every reason to, as delicately as he can, ask if Dave was sexually assaulted. It seems unusually cruel, even for bullying high school kids oppressing the socially awkward kids, that anyone would make the leap to, he must be gay because he was naked after his horribly traumatic ordeal. That's, I think, the other somewhat flimsy plot point. It seems to just be there to open a dialogue between Dave and Katie. Vaughn is becoming one of my favorite directors for these kinds of films because he establishes such a specific, consistent visual flavor, and his directing doesn't get in the way of the story. He even says in his commentary that it's important to him that the drama dictates where the camera goes and not the other way around, and that great acting should drive your movies rather than gimmicky cuts and close-ups and handycam work. Kick-Ass is all about those weird contrasts. It looks bright and tasteful much of the time like Raimi's Spider-Man, but then it's relentlessly violent in that setting. It's a movie that seduces me into enjoying things I don't usually like, and sometimes making me hate myself for it, and that's effective filmmaking. It would have been so easy for me to hate everyone in this movie and to walk out feeling like I needed a shower, but I really like this movie despite my sensibilities. I remain conflicted, but I also remain thoroughly entertained, and I'm giving Kick-Ass a 3 out of 4. And next time on Superhero Rewind, we're going to stay in the land of comedy, but this time of the PG variety, and I'll be reviewing Underdog. Stay tuned.